What's going on, people in internet land? Kimchi Chris here, and welcome to today's brand new episode of Rock Bliss with Kimchi Chris, or should I say Country Bliss with Kimchi Chris, because we are talking about an artist I never really thought we would touch on the channel. That's right, we are talking about the queen herself, Dolly Parton. Now, if you follow this channel for a while, you might say, Kimchi, I know that you don't like country music, you've spoke to this before, so why are you talking about Dolly Parton? Well, maybe you've seen something in the news recently, something pop up on social media, a website, who knows what, but earlier in the year, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame released their inductees for 2022. I did not make an episode focusing on that because I just didn't really care this year. We've done them in the past and it's always pretty much the same. These artists are nominated. They might get in. These artists are nominated. They'll definitely get in. And then someone's wronged every year. But you know, it's the Hall of Fame. Who really cares at the end of the day? But honestly, the most notable inclusion on the list of nominees this year was Dolly Parton. Now, it was surprising, confusing, and perplexing for so many reasons. Mostly because she's been eligible to be in the Hall of Fame since 1985. Hall of Fame started in 1986. Now, a lot of people, again, might assume, hey, it's the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Why are you arguing about a country artist not being in there? But there's several country artists in there. Johnny Cash is in there. Hank Williams is in there. Elvis Presley did country music. So that's not really a great way to look at it. But it's also surprising that this is the first time they ever even thought that Dolly Parton should be in there. Now, again, think of those artists I just named. She fits in with all of those, the classic pioneers of the genre. When people think classic country, those are some of the names that come to mind. And we'll get into that here in just a little bit. But Dolly Parton was announced as an inductee and everyone just assumed she'd get in. It made too much sense to not have her in the Hall of Fame. And then just a few days ago, as of the release of this episode, Dolly Parton pulled the most rock and roll, the most punk rock, the most Dolly Parton move she could possibly pull. She took herself out of the running. She said she didn't deserve to be in there. She felt that it wasn't really her place to be there. I'm going to throw her whole message up on the screen now. You can read it, but you gotta love how she even phrased this, basically saying she's going to put out a rock and roll record so that she can deserve to be in there at a later date, because in Dolly's world, she hasn't done enough for the rock and roll world, and that's just so Dolly Parton. It's hilarious, it's amazing, and it's what makes her a living, breathing, amazing cartoon character. Now, I'll be the first to admit, I don't really care about her music. I just don't like country music, so I'm a pretty unbiased person to kind of look at this here, but the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is supposed to be about influence, and oh boy has she influenced legions of people, specifically young women, to pick up guitars and start singing and, you know, basically make careers for themselves. I guarantee if you talk to any number of the musicians in the Hall of Fame, especially from recent years, some of the younger artists, if you will, I'm sure tons of them would say Dolly Parton was a huge influence on them, because she reaches further than country, similar to certain rock bands that, you know, reach further than rock, like the Rolling Stones or Led Zeppelin. She falls into that camp for country music. If you like music and you don't really have any biases to certain genres, you probably like Dolly. I plainly do have a bias towards a certain genre, with country being that one, but it's hard to deny that she's a quality person on top of all of this. I mean, look at her charitable work. She has given more money to charities than most of us will ever see in our lifetimes. She's also always stood up for LGBT and trans rights, which is just amazing, especially considering the genre and fandom she is in. They are not always the most, I don't know, accepting might be the right word, but nobody questions Dolly. She also donated money towards the vaccines for the pandemic situation. I mean, she's just an angel in a lot of ways, sent down from heaven to help people out. She seems like such a genuinely amazing person, and that's, again, what makes this whole situation so funny and interesting, because, again, it's such a Dolly move to kind of just pull herself out of the race and say, you know, let those other people, let them get their due, let them get their little awards and sit at their little expensive table with their meals and everything. I'll just hang out on the sidelines, put out a rock and roll record next year, and then, you know, get into the Hall some year down the line, because she is going to live forever. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's exactly what ends up happening. So while it's interesting and awesome and just so rock and roll that she pulled out of the race for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I think we need to go back here for a second and really look at what the Hall of Fame has been through the years as far as female representation, because I think that's something really, really, really important to look at here. So earlier we mentioned some country artists that are in there: Johnny Cash, Hank Williams Jr., Jerry Lee Lewis. A lot of people, considered him country back in the day. Notice something here. Notice something. They're all guys. If you go back to 1986 and look at the first year the Hall of Fame had anyone inducted, it was a boys club. It was all men. The second year, Aretha Franklin. Obviously, she deserved to be there. When you look at the list of people surrounding her and everything, of course she deserved to be there. But one female performer. That's it. Now, some people might argue that in rock and roll there haven't been as many prevalent female performers, and I wouldn't argue that back for a second, especially when you're talking about the older days like that. But they were inducting, again, a lot of people that fell more into R&B, country, soul, all these other genres that had tons of female representation, and the Hall of Fame didn't even touch them the first year. Didn't even touch them. That tells you a lot about them. Again, Dolly Parton would have been a perfect inductee that first year, but they didn't touch her. Aretha would have been a perfect inductee that first year. Didn't touch her. What's even more embarrassing about this for the Hall of Fame and whoever runs it at this point is you finally give Dolly a chance the same year you put Eminem on the ballot for induction. Now, if you're going to include hip-hop, obviously Eminem is a no-brainer, and they do include hip-hop now. He's a no-brainer, but this is the very first year Eminem was eligible. A white male. Okay? Obviously, there's not a lot about race here. Dolly Parton's obviously a white woman, but I'm just saying, first year that he was eligible to get in, he got on the ballot. Now, we all know that Eminem blew up pretty quickly when he came on the scene, and a lot of that is thanks to Dr. Dre, a black man who, of course, is not in there as a solo artist. It's not in there. NWA's in there, even though they didn't get in there their very first year. And I know we all know that Eminem's going to get in this year, but it seems probable that he will. But it seems like they ignore the people that really kind of helped him out there and got him to where he is. Now, you might say, what does all this have to do with Dolly Parton? We're talking about Dolly Parton, a country musician, and now we're talking about NWA. They couldn't be more opposite, but I think they have more in common than most people would think on the surface when it comes to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, I'm not going to argue that there aren't a lot of artists of color in the Hall of Fame, because there are. There really are. But I think that example of how quick Eminem was put on the ballot versus NWA and Dr. Dre, who's still missing as a solo artist even though he's done a lot, really says a lot about the institution and their representation of other artists that, just to be blunt, aren't white men. So I think that's why it took so long to get Dolly on there. Now, I could have just went off on this tangent for no reason, and I'm sure some people will not agree with me, and that's perfectly fine, but I think there's a problem with that, not only at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but the music industry in general. Now, we are getting better over time, but let's look at the current rock scene and look at some of the bigger, more current bands. There's not a lot of female representation. We're talking about rock and roll bands that are currently putting out music. They're played on the radio, if the radio even still exists anymore, and are headlining these different music festivals like Aftershock, Louder Than Life, things of that nature. Well, for one, those festivals are headlined mostly by dinosaur dad rock bands. We all love them, but that's just the truth. But when you go a little bit further down the tier of bands that are playing, the ones that are right under the headliners, you have artists like Ghost, Greta Van Fleet, The Struts, artists like that. The only one that even comes close to what I'm talking about would be Hellstorm. That's a female-fronted rock band that's pretty big. I'm not super huge on them myself, but they are there. And of course, country music has a problem with this as well. There are a lot more female artists than there have been in the past, getting bigger and bigger, but a lot of the biggest names are still the male artists. So I don't know where I'm going with this, and the fact that I don't know the solutions. I'm a white guy myself. All I can really do is hopefully support musicians that deserve supporting, basically. But overall, I think a lot of the reason we didn't get Dolly on the ballot to be in the Hall of Fame earlier really kind of whittled down to sexism, honestly. A lot of it did. A lot of it did. I've already seen other people talking about the same thing with this, the ones that were surprised she wasn't in there already, because I definitely fell into that camp. When I saw her on the ballot for this year, I just said, oh, she's not in there already? Really? Dolly Parton's not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? That's surprising. But I shouldn't be surprised, because the Hall of Fame is a joke. It's trash. I've made so many episodes about it, and every time I say I'm not gonna do another one, and then I get pulled back into it when something ridiculous happens, but this was just too good not to talk about because Dolly Parton's more rock and roll than pretty much all of us. So with all that being said, what do you think about this issue? Do you think that it's awesome that she pulled herself out of the running? Do you think it's a sexism thing? Because I think it'd be hard to deny that it took her that long to even be on the ballot. And do you think she'll eventually get inducted after she puts out her rock and roll album? I hope she does. I think it would be awesome. Plus, who doesn't want to hear Dolly Parton do some rock and roll? So with that being said, thank you so much for hanging out and watching this episode. If you're new around here, make sure to subscribe, give a thumbs up, turn on the notifications, all of those things and more. Again, my name is Kimchi Chris, and I will see all of you on the next episode.